Good afternoon and welcome to this final session of the CCUS 2021 conference, Increasing International CCUS Ambition. I'm Per-Olof Granstrom, CCSA EU Director and Operational Lead for the Zero Emissions Platform, ZEP, and the CCUS set plan. ZEP is advisor to the European Commission on the CCUS. I'm really happy to see the great and engaging speakers and the discussions over the conference days. With COP26 and the positive momentum for CCS and CCU setting the scene, we will now take into account some more international perspectives. It's obvious that we need to strengthen international collaboration. Where do we see the best opportunities and how do we ensure that we start with the low-hanging fruit? Using best practices from CCUS products and projects, regulatory frameworks, standards and funding mechanisms, both existing and being developed around the world, how do we ensure mutual interoperability to support development and deployment in the best possible way? And of course, how to take advantage of this. In this context, it's interesting to see what the IEA highlighted on CCUS in their 2021 World Energy Outlook from yesterday, that the investment environment for CCUS has substantially improved, where they mentioned Canada, Europe, and the United States. Here, the IEA also highlight the critical role for governments and financial institutions to improve CCUS financing opportunities, help to establish revenue streams, reduce risks, and create a sustainable market for CCUS investment. I would like to further set the scene by following up from the European session that just ended, emphasizing some of the crucial areas for cooperation. Cross-border CO2 transport and storage infrastructure is, of course, a key enabler for European large-scale decarbonization. And a growing number of European projects will rely on transport of CO2 by ship, which also is confirmed in the new EU ETS proposal, very much appreciated. It's crucial to reflect this also in other pieces of legislation, such as the TENI regulation that is currently being negotiated. At the same time, developing standards and operational procedures for CO2 shipping is crucial. ZEP and the CCSA are currently working on this, and the first results will be shared during the first half of next year. I would also like to highlight the existing European cooperation on CCUS R&I activities, the CCUS set plan, also including the UK, Norway, and associated countries. Just like we can see in the UK, we are hoping that the European Commission's CCUS forum that you heard about in the previous session will lead to the much needed strategy for CCS and CCU, also in the EU, setting targets, objectives, and volumes going forward to 2030 and 2050, crucially important. The need for cooperation is also clear on markets for low carbon products and methodologies for reductions and removals, certification, metering, and verification. I would like to highlight that CCSA has a very good position here for the European development, coordinating closely across the channel. And finally, we can see the strong need for support of market-ready projects. ZEP is strengthening its support here, and it's clear that there is a strong need also on a global level. We have a really great and knowledgeable international panel here today. Jen Wilcox, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management at the DOE. Tim Dixon, General Manager at IEAGHG. Jarad, only a couple of days old, Chief Executive at GCSSI. And Syrie, Vice President CCS at Shell. These titles only offer a glimpse of their experience and expertise, just to have that said. We will listen to the introductions from these 4 panelists first before we go to questions and discussion. Delegates, you can already now start putting questions for the panelists in your Google chat. We will start with a North American perspective. Climate goals and the role of CCUS, projects, policies and initiatives, incentives, and I think we are all very interested in to hear more about the positive development of the 45Q. Jen, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jennifer Wilcox, and I'm currently the Acting Assistant Secretary for the Fossil Office and Carbon Management at the U.S. Department of Energy. And it's an honor to be part of this panel today, especially in light of all of the hard work that's going into organizing the COP26 event that's scheduled for next month in Glasgow. And with the help of technology and incentives, like the federal tax credit, 45Q, the US economy aims to cut emissions by 50% by 2030, which is less than a decade away, and to produce 100% clean electricity by 2035, and ultimately reach a net zero US carbon economy by mid-century. Decarbonization is a cornerstone of President Biden's strategy, which means we have to look at every sector of the economy, from energy to manufacturing to transportation and the service sector, to truly make a difference. And to do so, we have to find ways to both reduce greenhouse gas emissions, in addition to the removal of the legacy CO2 from the accumulated pool in the atmosphere. And for our part, the Office of Fossil Energy has recently added the words carbon management to our name. And our mission centers around research, development, demonstration, and ultimately deployment priorities that will pave the way for net zero carbon emissions by mid-century. In the United States, we're really fortunate to have a wide variety of low carbon energy options, but we also have existing reliable fossil energy assets that we have to use responsibly. And while we've made great strides in putting wind and solar power onto the US grid, coal and natural gas still provide most of the electricity, generating roughly 60% of US electrical power today. So while we still continue to rely on fossil fuels to meet our energy demands today, we're also working toward minimizing the environmental impacts of our dependence on fossil fuels, in addition to decarbonizing the existing infrastructure for tomorrow. This will require carbon capture coupled to reliable and dedicated storage. To date, the Department of Energy has invested more than $1 billion in the development of systems and technologies for point source carbon capture, which captures CO2 directly from power plants. This is mostly what we've been focusing on. But moving forward, we're expanding our efforts to capture carbon emissions from committed infrastructure that's expected to persist through mid-century. And this includes some natural gas-fired power plants, in addition to harder to decarbonize industrial sectors, with a focus specifically on clean hydrogen, cement, and steel production. Just last week, the Department of Energy announced $45 million in funding for 12 projects to advance point source carbon capture and reliable storage. And these approaches aim to capture up to 95% of CO2 emissions from natural gas-fired power plants and steel and cement producers. But we also have to expand beyond the idea of just drawing a box around the unit that emits the carbon. We also need to understand the supply chain that goes into that box. And so we need to draw the box much larger to include the supply chains that go into the units, whether they're producing energy or making a product. And for this reason, our work also focuses on minimizing methane leakage associated with our natural gas supply chain, whether it's used as a feedstock for clean hydrogen, power generation, or LNG, liquefied natural gas exports. And thinking also in terms of carbon management, in addition to dedicated carbon storage deep underground, we're also investing in building the foundational science for catalytic conversion of CO2 combined with clean hydrogen for synthetic fuels and chemicals. And we're also looking at other longer-term carbon storage options, like mineral carbonation, which can ultimately be used as a feedstock for building materials like synthetic aggregates and concrete. Globally, this industry has the ability to scale to gigatons. Ultimately, we're really looking at stacking the number of approaches together to achieve deep decarbonization. And if this were a decade or more ago, we could maybe have just focused on avoiding emissions in the first place, deep decarbonization. But we're no longer in a place that we can do that. Climate models have made it very clear that in order to achieve net zero, in order to achieve or prevent 2 degrees C warming, to meet those targets, we also need to be pulling CO2 directly out of the atmosphere. Achieving net zero means that for every molecule of CO2 we emit, we have to pull it back out. And our efforts are focused on deep decarbonization or avoiding those emissions from entering the atmosphere in the first place. But again, we're out of time. And to achieve net zero, we need to scale up approaches that also take CO2 out of the atmosphere to counterbalance the truly hard to decarbonize sectors today. So my message today is that we have a unique opportunity, a compelling responsibility to help tackle the climate crisis and advance a net zero clean energy economy. Thank you again for inviting me to share this message with you, and I'm really excited for the discussion to come.
Thank you very much. A lot to reflect on, and so I would like all the delegates, please submit any questions you might have. I'm saving myself for the discussion a little bit later. So once again, thank you very much, Jen. We will now move to broader international perspectives, started with CCUS developments around the world, actions for CCUS scale-up, as we just heard, and reflections from the IEAGHG 15 conference earlier this year. Tim, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Per-Olof. And let me just share my screen. Yes, I was asked to say a few things in the context of COP26 that we've got coming up as well. So putting all of these things into an international perspective. And it's very good to hear Dr. Wilcox talking about the US ambitions there. And we know that the US does make things happen, as we can see from the recent space exploits that have been happening even this week. I'd just like to concentrate on a few minor or major points, actually. First of all, I have to show our disclaimer that we're not part of the International Energy Agency, but we're associated with them. But anything I say does not count as their views. But I will use their material because they're very good in their analysis on what needs to be done. And as we saw last year from the Energy Technology Perspectives 2020, when they look at the role of the mitigation actions we can do in the energy sector, CCUS has a big role. It's 25% of the mitigation action to achieve net zero by 2050. And they go into some more detail in their special report on CCUS. They drew from that, showing the different applications in the different sectors that we all know and we've all been referring to through this week in this conference. And this year, as you probably know, they produced their net zero roadmap, which got a lot of attention because it's got some quite strong messages within that. This is one option, one scenario for the energy sector to reach net zero by 2050. And there's some quite big, strong things in there. But within that, they do include that by 2035, CCS should be capturing 4 gigatons of CO2 every year. And by 2050, that's 7.6 gigatons every year. And that's in addition to all the other things they are suggesting. And this is different to the ETP scenarios in that this also includes behavior change in energy emissions reduction. And we've seen already what significant behavior change can achieve last year with COVID. CO2 emissions down by 6%. And unfortunately, we know that already this year they've gone up again. So putting this is what needs to be done. What is actually being promised, and this is where I take us to the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, and that's the Paris Agreement is based upon countries' voluntary pledges through their nationally determined contributions. These are got to be updated every 5 years. The first update was for 2020, and we've had 86 in so far updated NDCs. And of those updated NDCs, only 11 have CCS in, 8 explicitly, 3 implicitly, and you can see the countries there. So that's quite disappointing that not more have CCS explicitly in, but these are looking to activities by 2030. In the synthesis report that the UNFCCC produced in September of these submitted NDCs, they also take a view of the big picture. Where do these updated NDCs take us? And the bad news is not far enough. And this is plotting those against the socioeconomic pathways from the 1.5 IPCC report, and we're just on the pathway to 2.7 degrees at the end of the century. So not enough from those. What is more promising is that the Paris Agreement also asked for its long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies, LEDs or LTSs, there's 2 acronyms being used with that. And this is asking countries to look to mid-century and what their mitigation activities should be. And as of the 1st of October, 33 countries have submitted these, and 27 of the 33 include CCS as a mitigation action. So this is good. And these long-term strategies are making countries look beyond their political horizons and at what they need to be doing. And as of course, what we know is that if they're thinking of doing CCS by mid-century, it means they've got to start doing preparation now. So this is good for what's being promised, what's actually happening on the ground. Oh, sorry, I've jumped ahead of myself there. And just put it into the context of COP26. These are the UK presidency goals, and that's strengthening, getting countries to strengthen their NDC promises, which is something that's not going to happen in the COP, it happens by the countries before they get there. But increasing the climate finance, because we've not met the 100 billion per annum promised, that could happen in the COP. But a lot of activity in the COP will be focused around the Article 6, which is about international cooperation between countries in achieving their NDCs. And this could create mechanisms for emissions trading or generation of carbon credits and emissions trading between countries and also from projects. And we hope that this continues to use the rules for CCS, certainly, that were developed for the Clean Development Mechanism. So what's happening on the ground? Thank you to my colleagues in the Global CCS Institute. And I know they produced their new report 2 days ago, but this is from last year. And I use this because, yes, there's a lot of dots on this map, but what most interests me and us are the countries where there are no dots, the countries that are not yet looking at CCS or considering CCS, because we know that all large point sources have got to reduce and stop their emissions of CO2. And where do you find these countries? Yes, they come along to the COPs, because 195 countries are parties to the UNFCCC, and they'll all be there. And CCS in the UNFCCC, this is the story of it. I'm very pleased to say that IEAGHG have been very involved throughout, and it really started with the IPCC report in 2005 that showed that it was worthwhile doing at scale, emissions reductions at scale worthy of pursuing, and then some intense negotiations over 5 years, which resulted in CCS being accepted in the Clean Development Mechanism under the UNFCCC, so a general acceptance in the UNFCCC. And I was very lucky to have a prime seat in the negotiations as that was achieved in 2011. And then since then, as IEAGHG, we've been active with our partners in the UNFCCC side events. And this is where we can reach those countries without the dots in. Countries come along to these side events, and I think these are really important events. Countries come along and they ask, can I do it in my country? And we start them on the path of exploring whether they can do it. It gives them the information, etc., etc. And I'm very pleased to say we have some success already. We've helped Trinidad and Tobago and Nigeria to get moving with CCS in their countries. And I'm very pleased to say, hot off the press news is that at this COP26 in 2 weeks' time, We do have a side event there on accelerating decarbonisation of industries in non-Annex 1 countries, that's developing countries. And our partners are the CCSA, whose conference we are in this week, and the University of Texas International CCS Knowledge Centre in Bologna as well. And that's on the 11th of November. And I'm very pleased that Dr. Wilcox hopefully will be talking in that event as well. And as countries come along and ask, can we do it in our country? They also ask, if they're developing countries, how can we get some financial support to do an assessment of our geology, to do an assessment of our point sources, to do some capacity building. And the climate funds are really important for this. Now, the two main funds in the UNFCCC context are the Green Climate Fund and the CTCN's funds, Climate Technology Centre and Networks. And the Green Climate Fund is the big one. And whilst the IEA is saying that CCS has to be 25% of the emissions reductions in the energy sector, the Green Climate Fund has spent 0% on CCS so far. Luckily, or fortunately, the multilateral banks of the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank have CCS trust funds that have been supporting capacity building work in developing countries. And thank you very much to the UK government, who's the major donor to those two trust funds. So in terms of this context, this conference this week, I think what the UK, seeing the developments in the clusters being proposed and developed, and hopefully having good announcements in 2 weeks' time, the UK can lead by example to these countries. It's very hard to ask developing countries to do things that we're not doing. So lead by example, and the UK is moving quickly now, I think, to become a country that can do that. So thank you very much. Back over to you, Per-Olof.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now we have things to talk about for weeks together. So I hope that you can stay on for a little while in this session. We will do as we have planned. So we will continue on after we have gone through everyone. So we have a good basis for discussion. So continuing on our international outlook, I would like to invite, you're already here, Jarad Daniels, who's just started as Chief Executive for CCSI. Congratulations, Jarad. He will not stay on for the questions and discussion. However, you can still submit your questions to Jarad in the Hoover chat, and we will see to it that he will receive them. So the floor is yours, Jarad.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Per-Olof, and it's always a pleasure to share a conversation with Dr. Wilcox and Tim and Syrie and Per-Olof and others. Lots to talk about here today. So, again, the IEA analysis that Tim just presented clearly shows that CCS is essential to meet our climate mitigation goals and reaching climate neutrality or net zero emissions. And it certainly also helps to enable the low cost overall solution to meeting those goals, right? And so if we take a big step back, I think it's always good to include in the conversation, we absolutely need to drive in as much energy efficiency across the board and renewable energy into the mix as we can. But the fact remains that we're going to need CCS for many applications, for dispatchable power, when and where firming is required, in otherwise hard to abate industry sectors such as cement and steel, and to enable carbon dioxide removal at scale as well. And that was already mentioned. As Jen also mentioned, looking through a life cycle lens across the entire value chain, I think is essential to crafting good policies to decarbonize our society. And that's extremely important not to lose sight of. But on this basis, we know that the role of CCUS is significant. And, as the slides that Tim just showed, contributing to around 15% of the emission reduction expected to get us to net zero by 2070, according to the IEA analysis, and probably more than that as a percentage if we want to accelerate that time frame to reach carbon neutrality. So as Tim also mentioned, every year the Global CCS Institute, where I'm now, I think, 3 or 4 days on board, it releases its flagship Global Status of CCS report. And it provides an update and a comprehensive overview of the progress of carbon capture and storage developments around the globe. I think the global CCS community sees this as, the gold standard data set that we all pull, timely and accurate information from. I'm happy to state that just 2 days ago, we released this year's status report, and we did so in advance of when we normally do on a calendar, ahead of COP26. as we hope this information included in the status report will strengthen the case for more countries to include CCS in their mid-term plans and in their long-term strategies for more businesses to deploy CCS. As Tim mentioned, I think there's still room for improvement at national levels in terms of how much CCS is included in the conversation. But overall, now is truly an exciting time for CCS. The global status report shows that in 2021, the global CCS pipeline of facilities under development increased by almost a third, continuing a 4-year growth trend that we've seen of almost 30% growth per annum over the last 4 years. CCS is now seen as a critical element for meeting the climate challenge with immense versatility in its application, both for mitigating emissions and again, for carbon dioxide removal. We see building momentum in the number of both governments and private company leaders supporting this critical technology. And we're beginning to see serious discussions regarding CCS deployment at scale. I'll just note as one example, CCS is now included as part of the ideal policy mix called for by the International Monetary Fund's World Economic Outlook that was just released this month. So, you know, a lot of momentum and a lot of good data points that are coming to light. Currently, as our report overviews, there's 135 facilities in the CCS pipeline, 27 in operation, 4 in construction, and the remainder under development. We've added 71 new facilities to our database so far in 2021. 41 of these are in North America and 25 in Europe. These 2 jurisdictions generally have the most progressive investment environments related to CCS, and they remain the leaders in CCS development. And I think we heard from Dr. Wilcox, you know, some of the good things that the Biden administration is doing to progress all forms of clean energy, and CCS is part of that from a policy perspective. But in addition to North America and Europe, there are also a number of new countries entering the CCS landscape. And we've seen new data points from Belgium, Denmark, Hungary, Indonesia, Italy, Malaysia, Sweden. So more to go, but it's nice to see positive motion in these countries. They're new to the list this year. When we look at the drivers behind this momentum, undoubtedly the key driver is adoption of more ambitious climate targets and increased actions. There's now more than 100 countries and several thousand companies with net zero targets. And this has created, I think, a virtuous cycle. Governments have reacted by strengthening policies to drive private sector action and investment. And the private sector seeing, you know, strengthened business cases and for CCS and as part of that, have responded by advancing new projects and developing new business models to reduce cost and risk overall. And this has given rise to, you know, networks as a preferred development method, and the creation of new strategic business partners and partnerships around CCS projects. So there are more than 30 CCS networks in development currently around the world. And overall, I think more and more people, both governments and industry leaders are alike, are realizing that we just simply can't achieve our goals without a healthy amount of CCS in the mix. So looking at the facilities under development, what's immediately evident is the diversity of the sector CCS is being applied to. While earlier applications of CCS were predominantly in low, you know, capture cost applications such as gas processing, we're now seeing CCS facilities in hard to abate sectors such as cement and steel, and in power generation and carbon dioxide removal as well. And indeed, it's this versatility of CCS that makes it such a unique and important solution in our overall climate toolkit. Earlier this week, the Global Cement and Concrete Association publicly released their climate ambition, where their members came together to set, you know, net zero concrete targets by 2050. And they explicitly included CCS as a critical technology needed to address their process emissions. So companies need a license to operate, and CCS is part of that required toolkit for some industries. But even with this positive momentum and broadened interest in support for CCS, we should probably not lose sight of the fact that to achieve net zero emissions, CCS capacity must increase on the order of 100-fold by 2050. And that will require on the order of $1 trillion US of investment over the next 30 years. And while this may sound daunting, it's not beyond the capacity of the private sector to accomplish. It's achievable, provided that governments and industry and the financial sector find ways to efficiently and effectively work together. Governments need to establish appropriate policies to support and drive investment. Industry is going to need to build, own, and operate the CCS facilities, and they're going to need to develop successful business models that support large capital investments required. And the financial sector has a role to play too. They must find ways to spread the financial risk, and include CCS in sustainable development portfolios, and of course, make appropriate returns. So let me just say there's a good number of international organizations and multilateral efforts that are already working and will continue to work together to progress CCS, including, as we heard under Tim Dixon's leadership, the IEAGHG program and all of their great work, the Clean Energy Ministerial CCUS initiative, new work under mission innovation that's coming forward, and of course, the Global CC Institute where I now reside. For example, the SEM CCUS initiative has engaged a good number of financial sector leaders to develop a set of key financing principles for CCS. And they continue to engage thought leaders in the finance sector to progress CCS conversations with financiers and investors alike. We're all part of this global CCS community and working together to speed CCS deployment because, again, the climate math says that we must. What's absolutely crucial is that the public and private sectors work hand in hand to put in place appropriate policies that can drive and unlock investments. Ultimately, policy needs to provide investors with confidence that they can have robust and a durable business case and positive returns. And there are many elements to this, and Tim's already mentioned some, explicitly defining the role of CCS in national emission reduction plans, such as in the NDCs that were just discussed, facilitating the development in CCS networks and storage opportunities, ensuring robust regulatory regimes. Some countries already have that, some there's more work to do. And where necessary, providing grants. All of these are important policy tools and next steps for deployment. And let's not forget that time is not on our side. There's an urgency here. The road ahead is challenging, but CCS is increasingly well-placed to make vital contributions to net zero emissions by mid-century. We must seize the opportunity and act with urgency. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jarad. That was smart, saying that much and then not staying for the discussion. But thank you very much. With everything said, just one word that sort of hits me is urgency, if we are going to make this happen. So thank you very much, and we will share the questions we get with you afterwards as well. So once again, thank you very, very much for joining us.
Wonderful, thank you.
So that finally, we will hear a global operator's perspective, looking at CCUS project development. Syrie, welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Per-Olof, and indeed, thank you, Rachel, for sharing my slides. Actually, I have to say, it is amazing to listen to the conversation that's just gone before me. You may not know it, but actually I was the technical lead for the Quest project in Canada. And if I think of the conversations we were having back when we were developing Quest, and I listen to the conversations now, you can see just how far this conversation has come. Rachel, if you don't mind moving through the next slide, which is just our disclaimer, and straight on to this one. So I think the key thing here is Shell has actually been active in carbon capture and storage for a long time now. I've already alluded to the fact that I was active in this back in the 2008s when we started looking at Quest. But actually, we were equally the first of the oil and gas majors to actually come up with a net zero emissions target. We are actually very clear that by 2050, in step with society, we should be a net zero energy business. And we're also very clear that this is just not our scope 1 and scope 2, but also our scope 3 emissions. That's very distinctive, if you like. That means that actually for us, our emissions peaked in 2018 at around 1.7 gigatons, and we expect to move down to zero by 2050. The other thing that we've actually also been very clear about is this year, we were the first of the oil and gas majors to come up with the fact that we have a very distinct ambition. We will be storing over 25 million tons of CO2 per annum by 2035. So that's a couple of things. How are we going to do that? Well, I think indeed you've heard the others allude to actually moving towards a model, if you like, and looking at CCS more holistically. And so one of the things I want to allude to here is the fact that we're moving away from, as I put it, looking at CCS very one-dimensionally. And what do I mean by that? Well, when we did the Quest project, it was a one-dimensional project. We were looking at our own emissions, And actually, we were capturing our own emissions, working with the Canadian government, and actually saying, for the opportunity here, the subsidies, can we capture them? Can we store them, etc.? So that's one dimensional. And then what do we mean when we say we go to the second dimension? Well, the second dimension, I think some of the other panelists have alluded to as well, which is looking at, as we move our product down the value chain to the ultimate consumer, be it individuals like yourself, myself, be it companies, etc., that product actually attracts CO2 prices and CO2 emissions down its life cycle. So if we take those into account, can we now utilize those to develop a CCS scheme? And then the third dimension is actually moving away from that and working with others and coming up with what we call a CCS industrial hub. And I've put here, if you like, 6 potential elements of that. Indeed, net zero emissions from our own operations, lower carbon gas, so that's indeed capturing from gas-fired power plants, blue hydrogen, and actually Quest is actually a blue hydrogen project. Most people don't actually know that. Bioenergy with CCS. Now, this comes back to one of the things that I think Jennifer Wilcox alluded to, which is getting to the world of negative emissions. So bioenergy with CCS. The other one is indeed direct air capture, and that's taking emissions out of the atmosphere and storing them underground. And then finally, decarbonising sectors. And this is working with the other hard to abate industries, be it cement, steel, chemicals, glass, plastics, you can name them. And so that is what I mean when I talk about moving to CCS as an industrial hub. And I think Shell is actually uniquely positioned to play in this space. And I'm showing some of that on the left-hand side of this chart. These are the projects we've got active at the moment, the 3 in the UK. I'll come back and do a little bit of a deep dive in that space, where we're active in Acorn. We're a partner in Net Zero Teesside, the South Wales Industrial Cluster. We've also got those in operations. We're active in Quest. We're a partner in Gorgon, Northern Lights, the Technology Centre Mongstad. We've literally just announced very recently our participation in the Aramis project in the Netherlands. And of course, we're a customer in Porthos. Now that means we're actually unique, that we actually played the customer role for some of these carbon capture and sequestration opportunities. We're a service provider in others. And then the last bit is we're actually a technology provider, as in we are active in the, shall we say, design and use of a means for that carbon capture and storage, with a very active research program in that space. If you don't mind moving to the next slide, please. So you heard the others mention about actually, what do we do about scaling up, about the fact that this is large capital investments, they've got a long lifetime. That means they've equally got a long payback period, which means we need to work with the governments, we need to work with others to ensure that there's clear incentives, we can get the right business models in place so that we can invest at pace and continue to invest, and equally balance that risk and reward elements. And these different components all have a different investment proposition, be it the capture versus the pipeline. Actually, when you're talking transport, be it pipeline versus shipping, and then the storage element. And then indeed, there's the other piece, which is how do we get value out of the products we create from this, be it low carbon hydrogen, low carbon steel, cement, or other elements. And so what I've shown here is indeed the way that we see this working, where another technology such as blockchain can come into account, where, as we mentioned, that we have net zero emissions targets, and that's be it ourselves, be it other companies, governments, then actually that means we've got a carbon budget that we need to work within. It means that we need that assurance process that actually we have stored so many million tons. And then we use something like blockchain that we can track that product, be it low carbon steel, from its point of origin all the way through to where you or I as a customer can then sit there and say, actually, I'm purchasing a lower carbon product in terms of my car or whatever, if you like. One of the other things I want to build on here is indeed, I think it was Per-Olof mentioned this right at the front, and that's about things like how do we work together in this space? How do we look at things which can help reduce the costs? And that's the standardization about loading, offloading, ports, harbors. how do we actually make this an integrated system? Because when you heard the numbers that were being thrown out, 4 gigatons, 5 gigatons per annum, that's the scale of the current oil and gas industry just operating in reverse. What we can't afford to do is to, if you like, not work together and actually standardize on some of these key elements as we go forward. And so that means indeed regulated projects, and equally, how do we actually move as quickly as possible from the current subsidized version towards a liberalized market where we get these market forces working. And that's what I mean by actually putting in, if you like, this piece about the agreed product benchmarks, where we end up with a preferential price, shall we say, for a lower carbon product, or indeed it gets a preferential market share potentially. And that's how we can actually get these market forces working in this space. So what I'd like to do now is maybe flip from me talking very generically about the bigger portfolio towards a more specific one, back to the UK, if you like. And this is just an example. If you move to the next slide, please, Rachel. So this shows indeed, the projects that Shell is active in the UK. And what you can see here is indeed how the UK could sit in that larger position. It's got world-class storage potential, as in it has a large sector of the North Sea. We've got shipping. Shipping can enable both areas of the UK without access to stores, but also areas of Europe without access to stores to also participate in CCS. To do this, what do we need? Well, we need to be able to ensure that we are maturing sufficient storage and that pore space is accessible in a timely fashion. That means that we need both the right licensing regime. We need actually equally the investment profile that allows us to be moving ahead of the volumes which are coming out of industry to de-risk the next piece of storage. And actually it also means that we need to understand where we have potential competition for seabed access, because we can't move the geology when it comes down to it. And then to summarize, what I'd like to say is, in listening to the others that joined us or are joining us on this panel, is this is a potential growth sector. And it's a growth sector in multiple ways. It's got a huge challenge, and we've got a huge challenge to deliver the carbon capture and storage at the scale that we've heard the IEAGHG, the GCSSI, the US DOE, and indeed Per-Olof representing the EU to talk about. With that great challenge actually comes also great opportunity to sit there and look at this and say, how can we actually de-risk this, both in the project sense, but actually also in that economic viability sense. And so for me, I think the whole thing here is the UK's climate ambition at the moment says 10 million tonnes by 2030. But actually, if you go back to the carbon budget, it says it's got to be 20 million tonnes by 2030, 80 million tonnes by 2040, and 100 million tonnes by 2050. And so I think the whole challenge here is, how do we bring that forward and stop ourselves keep pushing it and backloading that growth element? And the key thing here is, I think you heard David Bunch, our country chair, challenge at the event on Tuesday night around, well, actually, why can't this be 30 million tonnes by 2030? So 30 by 30. It's a bold ambition, but with the right policy, business frameworks, and that ability to enable the investment and to bring the financing in, then we think within the investors can actually invest with confidence to move this forward. And I think the other key thing is to recognize where we have that right combination of geology, infrastructure, people, and government ambitions. And I think you saw that there's certain parts of the world where the projects are already moving. And that's where that nexus of those things comes together and actually enables business to move forward with confidence. And I think that's where I'd like to leave it. Thank you, Per-Olof.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Syrie. And we have added another huge chapter to a possible longer longer discussion. So now, thank you, Syrie. Thank you, all panelists. We will go on to start a little bit regarding questions and discussions. And so I would be happy if you are doing exactly that, to start your cameras again. And I would like to start with you, Jen. So fascinated by the 45Q and the development there. So looking at the increased value, can we see competition and really driving costs down and a new development? So my question is really, how do you think that this change will change the dynamics?
Sure. Yeah, so right now, the way that 45Q is priced, you know, it maxes out at $50 a ton for when carbon capture is coupled to dedicated storage. That amount really isn't high for some of the more dilute sources, like what we see in the power sector, but for more of the concentrated sources. So those examples are like bioethanol, for instance, and also even in some cases, hydrogen production from natural gas as a feedstock. The CO2 concentration is higher in those cases than it is from a power plant. And so we're seeing a lot of activity, even at this price, even at $50 per ton, we're seeing activity in that space from the private sector. In terms of, you know, the Department of Energy, we've invested a lot in the front-end engineering design studies for the industrial sector, in particular cement and steel. And this is the first step. So investing in that first step, the FEED studies, then can lead to the demonstration scale or the pilot scale. And the other piece that's driving it, along with 45Q for these industries, is the fact that there's a market out there today in the private sector that's looking for low carbon supply chains. Low carbon supply chains associated with steel production, cement, and concrete, they don't exist today. And so because there's that demand for that higher value product in private sector willing to pay more for it, there's that push combined with the 45Q sees activity in the space. The reality is, though, is that a lot of the bulk of the emissions are really associated with the power sector and the fossil fuels like natural gas and coal that feed into that, as I mentioned. And the reality is 45Q at $50 a ton is not high enough in order to just help to incentivize those sectors. We had the project Petronova, right, which is tied to enhanced oil recovery. But with the volatility of the oil price, that project was shut down. And so what we're looking at is trying to de-risk projects and looking at really coupling them with dedicated storage. So what we're looking at now in terms of our investments for FEED studies is really trying to look at what's the committed infrastructure that's going to persist through mid-century. A lot of the natural gas-fired power plants aren't slated to retire anytime soon. And so a lot of our focus is trying to leverage the investments that we have made on coal. Turns out that a lot of those same separation processes, those same chemical companies can be applied to exhaust streams from natural gas, to exhaust streams from cement. So we're trying to leverage that and invest in the power sector like natural gas so that that demonstration scale, when that can take place, the costs become transparent. Once those costs become transparent, they can feed into the right price of 45Q. And so that's, you know, so the 45Q as it's priced today is helping with the concentrated sources, but we still need to close the gap for the more dilute sources, which is where the government has to play a role in funding those demonstration scale projects in the early days.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. The questions will be very different since we are talking about so many different areas. So I would then go to Tim and start with you at least, and just to take at least a little piece of a question here from the Hoover chat. So to meet the Paris Accords, as you can read here, 15% of all the emissions reductions need to be achieved by CCS. Could you comment on that a little bit?
We need CCS. Yes, yep. The IPCC says it. The 1.5 report has 4 scenarios. 3 of them rely heavily on CCS, and the 4th one that doesn't is really expensive and relies upon big societal change that we just didn't achieve last year with COVID. So we need CCS.
Could I add?
Fast enough? No, it's not, and everybody I think recognises that. And that's why we are, people are seriously looking at direct air capture, as Jennifer said, because, we've got we only have one planet. We don't have a planet B, all those phrases, we really don't. We've got to control the climate change on this planet. And what was worrying to me, not just that we don't have enough scale up yet, and I'm an optimist because we do have the means. Governments have the ability to create their policies to stimulate businesses to do these projects. But what worries me also was the IPCC's AR6 first report that came out last month on the science of climate change. There's lots of CDR in there, carbon dioxide direct removal, more than we expected in that science of climate change report. But one of the points they make is that it's the benefit of removing CO2 from the atmosphere after it's emitted is not as good as stopping it from being emitted in the first place. There is a rebound effect from if you start going net negative in CO2 in the atmosphere, reducing CO2 down, there's rebound from the oceans degassing and the soil degassing and releasing CO2 back into the atmosphere. So it really emphasised that it's better to stop the emissions first,
of course,
and then direct air capture afterwards is for the bits you can't do by stopping the emissions first. So again, we need to do all of these things, and it all comes down to policies from governments.
And we're also looking forward to the reports coming next year, following up on this report, of course. So sort of a positive answer, I think. So optimistic, no?
We have the means, for sure.
Yeah, that's very good. Thank you very much for that. I will go over to Syrie. And again, the question will be very, very different here. And again, you have a lot of items that we could ask about. But of course, we are intrigued by the market. We have to have a market where people actually start buying things for the right price. And this is a political decision, and it is costly, and that has to come out somewhere. So my question to you is, very, very interesting and quite controversial as well, your description regarding how to transfer over borders, the value, and so forth. And my question is, what is the next step regarding this low carbon product market? Where do you see that someone can do something, and who should that be and where?
So I think actually there's already movements in that space. And actually, I think in some ways the voluntary market is maybe pushing it, and the regulatory piece may catch up. Now that's my view. I'm not going to say that that's the official view. Let's put it that way. But you already see things like some car manufacturers stating that they will be creating cars with low carbon steel. Now, actually, that means they've got to be able to access low carbon steel. I think if you look at that entire value chain, CCS is expensive if you look at it at the steel mill. But actually, by the time you get all the way to the end consumer and you talk about low carbon steel in the purchase of your car, it's actually a much more minor purchase differential, shall we say, than for the steel mill itself. And so I think that's the whole thing about, as well as looking at things like electric vehicles, well, actually, it's looking at what's the CO2 footprint of the construction of the vehicle itself. And that's why I utilised in my little cartoon something we've all been educated in. We've all been educated as we look at the back of a fridge or a washing machine around that energy efficiency piece. And it's actually, how can we bring that across into our consumer purchase power as we purchase those bigger ticket items? So that's one thing. You've got that bit about actually, a potential price differential, if you like, on the higher end consumer goods. But I do think there's other elements, which is in larger construction projects, etc. Is there an expectation that a certain percentage of cement has to be blue cement, steel has to be blue steel? You can add blue whatever it is, that expectation starts coming through, that then gives the heavy industry that incentive to move forward and to not just rely, Jennifer was mentioning 45Q gets you to a certain point. It doesn't get you the whole way. This is the way to bring that piece in and to bring that value right back through the value chain that makes it a voluntary move through the system rather than having to rely too much on subsidies and government grants, etc.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think we would really like to see something like this. It would make life so much easier to understand what it's all about. And of course, back to what we started talking about, the cooperation across borders, transferring values regarding CO2 across borders. Of course, that has to be done from an international global perspective. So I'm really looking forward to. We know that there are initiatives going on, but I'd really like to see real steps taken in this direction. I would like to come back to one thing. So very often we get, since we have all three of you here on the panel, very often we hear, oh, it's an unproven technology. What is this? We can't trust this and so forth. And at the same time, we have 25 years of experience in Europe, at least regarding storage of CO2. And you have 50 years experience in the US regarding CO2 transport. So how can we pack this together? Do you have any comments, anything to add regarding this? How do we really communicate this in order to help ourselves to take another step when it comes to public perception, society perception? Anyone?
I can go first if you want. I think it's just having real projects to point at. And the Global Institute's report that comes out is a very helpful guide to that. When we present in the COPs, we try and get real projects, examples on there as well. That's why we work with the International CCS Knowledge Centre. And we saw the impact of Mike Menier standing up when people were saying it's a unicorn technology, it can't be done. He said, well, here's one I made earlier, 2014, and still operating. And yes, we know there was, the learnings happen with at least large-scale first-of-a-kind projects. But the fact that we can do that and take the learnings and share those, as the International CCS Knowledge Centre is doing in its day job, and apply those to other plants, such as it did with its SHAN study, big cost reductions, etc., like that. It's having real projects to point at. So thanks also to Syrie for the Quest project. I think we did a report on that to do exactly that, share the learnings from Quest around the world and the cost reductions that would happen if when another one's built like that as well.
And indeed, I'd like to pick up on that if you don't mind, Tim.
Yes, please.
The Quest project, it's been injecting now for 6 years, and indeed the good thing about the Quest project, and one of the requirements for the support from the Canadian government, was that it is all public domain. And actually everything we did in terms of the engagement with the public, our local stakeholders, the governments, etc., is all online. Yeah, all of the reports that my team wrote about the storage capacity, how to model it, how to run it, and indeed how it's operating now. Yeah. And the fact it's been operating for 6 years, it's got a 99.7% uptime, which I think is critical as we move away. It's one thing for this to be, if you like, on our own kit, yeah, and on our own production system. But actually, as we're working with others' production systems, be it a steel or a cement plant, then knowing that if we get this right, it can be 99.7% uptime and reliable. Because the last thing you want is your waste disposal stream effectively to bring down your production lines. And so I think sharing that and sharing that knowledge, it is absolutely critical as we move forward in that sense. So that for me would be one of the things. And the other part I think Tim also alluded to is, we have been operating CO2 pipelines since the 1970s. We've been extracting CO2 since the 1930s, And
Yeah.
actually, we've been doing CO2 EOR, which isn't directly analogous to CCS, but it is very, very closely analogous to CCS, equally since the 1970s. And I think it's laying all of that history out to help bring people along. It is so important.
And if I have just 30 seconds.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Because we haven't said it yet. One of the things I think that could be very important to have significant impact is engagement in communities early, before a project starts, well before, and also just being able to understand there is a mistrust, from frontline communities and in the legacy of fossil fuels. And so being able to bring in those frontline communities in part in the discussion, understand what the regional concerns are, whether it's air pollution or whether it's access to energy or clean water, and then being able to site projects in a way, deploy projects in a way that helps to bring benefits to those communities directly and translate that is going to be really important, because then you have that support, the sustainability and de-risking of the projects.
Thank you very much. I will not even try to conclude all the things we have been talked about. On the other hand, I will come back to all of you bilaterally to talk more about this. I hope that is okay. But I will say a couple of things. So first of all, possible. We have the means. I think that was crucial. Show real progress. Walk the walk. Show the benefit to the people, and also cooperate and engage. With that, I would like to thank you very much, all panelists, and also Jarad. Great discussion, too short, but maybe next time. And also thank you all delegates